This is Anarchast.
Hey humanoids, welcome to another edition of Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. I have coming in from Virginia, Keith Preston. He has a website called Attack the System, and the slogan of Attack the System is Pan-Anarchism against the state, Pan-Secessionism against the empire. And it's a great site, and he's got a lot of podcasts, and you get all of that. From near the belly of the beast in Virginia. But the first question we always ask Keith is, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, I remember reading sometime probably over 20 years ago, and I've tried to trace the source for this, but I haven't been able to find it. I don't recall the specific source, but I remember that Emma Goldman once said that anarchists are born and not made, and I think there's probably a lot to that. I've never been anything other than an anarchist. Now, I became involved with anarchism formally when I was in my early 20s. I first heard of anarchism probably about 5 years ago. 5 years before that. So it's really about 30 years ago now. And I know the first time I ever heard there was such a thing as anarchist, it struck a familiar chord, like it was something I'd always known about or should have known about. And I always figured it was something I'd follow up on. I didn't at the time because I had other things going on. And then about 5 years after that, we're talking about maybe the late 80s now, I started getting more into philosophy and history and political theory and things like that. And I went back and revisited this idea, anarchism. And I was an anarchist before I actually knew any other anarchist. I became interested in anarchism just by reading about it, before I ever met another person who called themselves an anarchist. And really, that's all I've ever been. I was never anything else. A lot of times when people are asked the story, well, how did you become an anarchist? They say, well, I used to be a Marxist, or I used to be a conservative, or something like that. I was never any of those things. I was always an anarchist.
Yeah, I actually agree with you completely. I agree that we're all born anarchists, and it gets sort of weeded out of us over time, unfortunately, and mostly because of public schools and the media constantly putting these crazy ideas like statism into our brain. So you have a website and you talk about Pan-Anarchism. What do you mean by that word?
Well, Pan-Anarchism is really just a term I use to represent all of the many different types of schools of anarchism. From the time I first became interested in anarchism as a philosophy and as a body of theory and that kind of thing, I noticed right from the start that there wasn't really just one type of anarchism. There were many different kinds, and over time, it seems to me that I to this day, I still come across new schools of anarchism or new approaches to anarchist theory that even I, who've been reading and studying about this stuff for 25 or 30 years, had never seen before. So it really is amazing how many different types of anarchists there are and different theories of anarchism. I'm always wanting to know more about all these different schools of thought. You've got anarcho-capitalism, you've got anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, all the more well-known ones. And then there's a lot of other sub-tendencies and peripheral tendencies as well. And what I'm trying to do at attackthesystem.com, one of the things I try to do is explore all of these ideas and focus on their commonalities. And what we at Attack the System work for is the development of something of a unified anti-state movement, recognizing that we've got all these many different currents of thought out there that are opposed to the state, that have opposition to the state as their primary or one of their primary values. And so we push for greater unity, if you will, sort of a united revolutionary front against the state for the purpose of dealing with some of these common issues that we all agree on. One thing that I've noticed about a lot of different types of anarchists is that they tend to spend a lot of time fighting with each other. They tend to argue a lot about arcane bits of theory and that kind of thing. And all that's interesting. I find those kinds of debates interesting myself, but I think in some ways it becomes a distraction over time. So I try to focus more on where we agree rather than where we disagree.
That's interesting, because I'm a bit of a different school of thought. I think there really is only one kind of anarchy, and that is non-aggression. And I really find those anarcho-communists and these syndicalists very strange. They seem to be quite a bit more violent, and maybe you can explain to me. And I'm totally, I have no problem with you trying to get all the anarchists together, and I think that's great, and I think everything that anyone can do to forward freedom is great. But I just find these anarcho-communists, they're really just communists. They want to get rid of the state, but then they want to impose their own state where you don't have private property rights. Am I wrong on that? Or what's your view on anarcho-communists? And maybe you can even explain syndicalism to me. I've never really understood it.
Well, I could approach that from a number of different angles. First of all, my own personal battles with these hard left anarchists are legendary. And if you Google my name on the internet, you can find all kinds of websites that those people run where they're attacking me in various ways. Ultimately, though, I don't necessarily think that the general theory behind anarcho-communism is necessarily incompatible with anti-statism. I think it's just a different method of social or economic organization. For instance, as far as prototypes for what anarcho-communism might look like in practice, you have these things like in Israel, you have the kibbutzim, these kind of collective communities. And if some people prefer to live in that kind of way or organize themselves in that kind of way, that's fine. I don't see any problem with that. Now, I'm opposed to anyone that wants to make that mandatory for everyone, of course. But that by itself, I don't think anarcho-communism as a theoretical system is necessarily compatible with the non-aggression principle that libertarian anarchists hold to. Of course, now where the problem comes in is that you do, as you mentioned, have these people that I used to call them the anarcho-leftoids. Nowadays, I tend to call them the anarcho-Bolsheviks. And they really do have a very, I would say, certainly intolerant and often violent, even predatory outlook on certain things. It's as to what I think about all that. The unfortunate thing is that in all movements of any kind, in all systems of thought, you have people who are original and thoughtful thinkers and have constructive things to say. And then you've got a more Untermenschen element that, unfortunately gives the rest of the movement a bad name. For example, in Christianity, you've got someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the great thinkers of all times, and then you've got these folks that play with snakes and, that kind of thing. So, and you have that among anarchists as well. You've got someone like Murray Rothbard or Pierre Joseph Proudhon or Peter Kropotkin or someone like that, and then you've got these Antifa hoodlums and people of that type. So, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to rescue the good name of anarchism from those kinds of elements. And again, it's not really a question of left or right or any one particular set of social or cultural values or any one set of economic theories even. But what I do see among those particular people that we're talking about is an extreme intolerance, and I think you're absolutely right that they're basically anarchists in name only. I'm very hesitant to say who's a true anarchist and who's not. I'm not really into that kind of idea of excommunicating people for holding the wrong ideas or whatever. But at the same time, by their fruits ye shall know them.
Yeah, and I agree. And one of the things about anarcho-communists that I have a problem with is in an anarcho-capitalist world, you can have communism. If someone wants to start up an area and they all voluntarily agree to not have property rights and to own everything amongst the collective, you can have that in a true anarcho-capitalist sort of a world. But in an anarcho-communist world, you can't have anarcho-capitalism. So that's why I really find that the communist side, these anarcho-communists, so-called anarcho-communists, they're not true, and I don't want to get into an argument or anything about whether they're true anarchists or not, and I don't think it's all that important. But I do think it's. I really find that they're not a true freedom movement as much as so-called anarcho-capitalists, where in an anarcho-capitalist world you can do whatever you want, you can own whatever property you want, but you and you can, like I said, you can have a commune, you can do whatever you want, but in a communist world you can't do that. What's your thoughts on property rights? Do you get into that? Have you thought about that? Because obviously that's a big issue with anarcho-communists.
Well, I believe that obviously that widespread ownership and dispersion of property is necessary for a free society. I mean, I'm against any kind of philosophy that wants to centralize the control over wealth or property. I'm certainly against any kind of philosophy that wants to have a state-run economy. I suppose one area of disagreement that I might have with some anarcho-capitalists is that I don't know that there's any one uniform system of property rights that I think is necessarily applicable to all different societies and cultures at all times. I remember reading something a while back where there had been, I read this on Robert Murphy's blog, who is an anarcho-capitalist, but he was saying that historically there have been something like 3,000 different definitions of property rights and so forth, and among different schools of anarchism and libertarianism, you have the various ideas about what constitutes legitimate ownership of property. You have probably the more mainstream of libertarianism, which advocates sort of a Lockean approach rooted in the ideas of John Locke, and that's the kind of libertarianism you find among someone like, say, Murray Rothbard or whatever. There are some other points of view like that are rooted in the ideas more of maybe Henry George or the mutualists, the followers of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and then there's Kevin Carson, who's fairly articulate and certainly very intelligent and educated exponent of that point of view today. So I would probably, more so than many anarcho-capitalists, I would probably allow for a little bit more variation in the theories about what constitutes legitimate control over property and resources and so forth. And I think in a civilization where anarchists became the dominant or most prevalent political philosophy, what you might end up seeing is different groups grouping off into different kinds of communities and enclaves, or what we might call provinces or something like that in a state system, where there might be one system of property rights in this place and another system of property rights in the other place. And I think it's possible for there to be peaceful coexistence about different ideas like that.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I asked you about the question, because it isn't a super clear answer. What is property rights exactly, and how do you get property rights, and all that sort of stuff. And there's a lot of work, a lot of philosophical work that has been done on it, but we haven't actually had a very anarchic world in our lifetimes. And so I agree with you. I think what would happen if we actually, more people move towards this, we would have different groups and they'd have different definitions of property rights. But as long as it's all voluntary and people agree to it and they'd all work it out themselves, I think it could all work well. And I think that we'd be fascinated by what would happen and all the ideas that would come about if we could actually live in a place without a state that told us these are the rules, this is the way it is, that sort of a thing. It'd be very interesting, and it'd actually be very exciting to see what kind of communities spring up.
Yeah, I agree.
And yeah. And so with Attack the System, how long have you been doing that website?
That website went online in January of 2001.
Oh,
so,
wow.
13 and a half years now.
Wow. Good for you. And how's it been going?
Well, it very slowly, interest in the website has built up and developed, and in the last few years, it's really taken off. Up until probably about 5 or 6 years ago, it was a very amateurish site. It looked like some third-rate, multi-level marketing advertisement site. When it first went online, it was back in 2001, and even that recently, web technology and web design and so forth wasn't what it is now. A friend of mine's kid brother, who was in high school at the time, designed the original site, and it was a very amateurish site. It was mostly just something that I used to post my original essays and that kind of thing online, and just to get some ideas out. And over time, it was converted into a blog. We had a webmaster, Jeremy Wieland, who was able to convert it into a blog, and it became a somewhat widely recognized blog. And then a couple of years ago, R.J. Jacob, who's our current senior webmaster, he converted it into a full-fledged custom website, and now we're doing podcasting directly from the website, and we have a lot of other features. We've got a more professional quality website, and the traffic continues to grow to the site. It's probably at an all-time high right now. And it's, easily, the traffic to the site is easily 5 times what it was probably just a few years ago.
That's great. And so, getting back to different forms of anarchism, how would you describe yourself as an anarchist? Would you say you're an anarcho-capitalist, or you just say you're an anarchist?
Well, as long as I've been an anarchist, I've always preferred just the label of anarchist. I've always tended to avoid a lot of the hyphens and adjectives. There was a strand of anarchism back in the late 19th, early 20th century called anarchism without adjectives associated with Voltaire de Cleyre and people like that who shunned some of the different labels that were around back then, anarcho-communist, individualist anarchist, and all that. I think Karl Hess, who was a legendary figure in the history of American anarchism, he had a similar term, anarchism without hyphens, and Pan-Anarchism, I suppose, is my hyphen. Or I've also called myself an anarcho-pluralist, which is actually a term I picked up many years ago from a fellow named Sam Dolgoff. Sam Dolgoff was an elderly anarchist that I met in New York City back in the 80s. He was probably in his 90s at the time. He had actually been part of the classical anarchist movement in the early 20th century, and he had known Emma Goldman and people like that personally. But he used to call himself an anarcho-pluralist, which to him meant he wasn't necessarily in favor of one uniform system of anarchism. And I have adopted that term since then. I look at it like I'm interested in all of the different schools of anarchist or anti-state or libertarian or pro-freedom or anti-authoritarian or decentralist thinking. I don't think anybody has any monopoly on the truth when it comes to the systems of thought like that. There are different ideas that I probably am more sympathetic to than others. There are some that I find more easily comprehensible than others. But I'm really interested in anyone that is opposed to the state and the institutional apparatus of the state, the coercive apparatus of the state. You were asking me at the beginning about how I became an anarchist, and I said I've always been an anarchist, and I think just instinctively that really was the case. And I know when I was a little kid in the 70s, I used to hear about the Vietnam War and think, well, what an awful thing it is that the state can send you off to go kill other people and get killed, over something you have no stake in or in some place you've never heard of before. And I've always been instinctively opposed to the state and to arbitrary institutional authority generally. And I'm interested in anyone that recognizes some of these questions, and I see that all over the political spectrum.
Yeah, me too. One of the other part of your tagline is pan-secessionism against the empire. And I always say, if at first you don't secede, try again. And we're actually seeing some interesting things right now. We're seeing in Colorado, they're trying to secede somewhat from the state. They're trying to secede from Colorado state. In your time of thinking this way, have you seen some progress in terms of the possibilities for us to actually secede from the state? Or can you maybe comment on what you've seen during the last 10 or 20 years in terms of progress, and I mean real progress, not like progressives, but actual progress towards a better world that doesn't have as much state control?
Oh, I've seen enormous progress in a lot of different areas. When I started out doing this, when I was an anarchist activist in the 1980s, the Cold War was still going on then, and the Soviet Union was still intact. The arms race was still going on. Since then, we've seen the breakup of one of the world's two major empires. What was once a world empire, since broken up, fallen apart, and a lot of those countries now have, in many ways, become freer countries than what we have in the West. So I think that's one major change that I've seen. Also, I have seen other, there's so many different ways in which I could approach that question, but I've seen the growth of anarchist, of libertarian, of anti-state thinking in so many different ways. I know back in those days when when I would tell people I was an anarchist, they look at me like they'd never even heard of what I was talking about, or they thought it was something that was, it was like I was saying I was a child molester or something like that. Nowadays I don't get that. I mean, there are still people who think, well, that's a little extreme, that's a little odd, or whatever. But most people, at least, or many people, I found nowadays at least have some idea what I'm talking about, or how at least have heard of anarchism, or if they're at all familiar with the philosophy, they're not as hostile to it as I once found, or maybe it's just I associate with better people now. So I have seen the growth of anti-state movements. As far as secession, I some years ago came up with the idea that probably one of the best ways to break up the kinds of concentrated power we see in states was through secession. Secession of nations from empire, secession of provinces from nations, secession of towns from states, secession of individuals from cities and things like that. And I've seen the growth of secession movements and independence movements all over the world. I think the end of the Cold War really gave new life to some of that as well. Before that, a lot of most nations around the world were pretty much forced, either by circumstances or literally at the point of a gun, to take sides in the Cold War. And I think the end of the Cold War really gave new life to independence movements and self-determination movements all over the world. I'm really interested in the theories of Martin Van Creveld and some of the other theoreticians of fourth generation warfare. I think some of the best insights into where the state is headed come from that circle. That what they'll argue is that the state is essentially losing its monopoly on warfare, and the state is losing its monopoly on so many other things just through changes in the world, just through things like communications technology, like the internet, travel the ability to travel in ways that were once inconceivable. We can get on a jet and fly anywhere in the world in a day now. And that was inconceivable in past times. And it seems like there's between the growth of the global economy, between the growth of the internet, the growth of other forms of technology, the fact that the state is losing its monopoly on warfare, it does seem like the state is breaking down in many ways. Plus, the state really doesn't inspire the loyalty that it once did. You don't hear as many people. You still hear too many people saying this, but you don't hear as many people saying things like, my country, right or wrong, love it or leave it. I used to hear that a lot when I was growing up. Back in the Cold War days, back in the Reagan era, back during the Vietnam War era, that kind of stuff. I don't hear it as much now.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think interesting thing to me is that even 10 years ago, even the word libertarianism was very unknown, and even myself, I hadn't heard the word, and now it's becoming very popular, and actually it's almost anyone has heard of the word, and even have people like Glenn Beck, who's a neocon, but he calls himself a libertarian, and you have people on the left side, people like Bill Maher, who's liberal, but he calls himself a libertarian. So this term is actually becoming trendy, and I think what will happen is as more people find out about libertarianism, they'll then go the next step and find out about extreme libertarianism and find out about anarchism more and more. And like you said, that word is becoming less and less derogatory. And I think a lot of the work that people like yourself are doing, and so many other people, Stefan Molyneux, so many other people, and including our Anarchast. And when I first started this podcast, some people said I shouldn't call it Anarchast because that word is scary to some people. And I said, we have to take some claim to some of these words. We can't just let them all get destroyed. Like the word liberal used to actually mean almost a libertarian, but that word's gotten destroyed, and all kinds of words get destroyed over time, including anarchy. And I think we have to take a stand at some point. And I think we're finally getting this word back, and people are starting to realize it doesn't mean people who go around breaking windows and throwing bombs. It actually has other meanings that are much more peaceful, and actually that's the root of the word, is voluntary and non-aggression. So we're running out of time. I'm really sorry because I'd like to talk to you longer, but we're running out of time here. So Keith Preston, you have a website. Why don't you let people know where they can find out more information about your work?
Sure. Well, the website is attackthesystem.com. And like I said, it's been online for about 12 years, 13 years. There's a lot of original articles there by myself and others explaining anarchist theory and various types. We do original podcasts. We have original podcasts that come out every week or so, sometimes a couple times a week, where we talk about either more theoretical questions or we talk about contemporary events and news items. We have interesting guests on. We have our senior editors and co-editors that come on and talk from time to time. So it's definitely a website you should get in the habit of checking out. You can also follow us on Twitter. The parent group for Attack the System, which is American Revolutionary Vanguard, that's our dissident anarchist tendency. There's a Twitter, you can follow us on Twitter. One of our co-editors, Vince Reinhardt, does a great job with that. We have a Facebook page, the Attack the System Facebook page. You can also follow me on Facebook as well.
Great, and we'll have links to all of those places in the notes down below, and definitely check it out and keep up the great work. So that's Keith Preston coming in from Virginia, and this has been Anarchast, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.